Welcome to Women in Leadership Talk, where you'll hear from successful women who are empowering other women with their stories of adversity, resiliency, and success. And here is your host, Vicki Bradley, founder and CEO of Women in Leadership Empowered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you, and we're thrilled to have Natalie Cramp joining us from London, England. So Natalie, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. And audience, as always, we're super grateful that you choose the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Please make sure you reach out to us, share this episode, subscribe to our channel. That's what keeps us alive and keeps great content coming to you. So let me give you a little bit of feedback on Natalie and why I've asked her to join the show today. There's all kinds of conversations about AI and data or data, depending on how you say it. And so Natalie, she's a partner at JMAN Group, and she's the chair of Women's Health, Women in Data. She has also been named 20 in Data and Technology in 2023 and has been recognized multiple times in the top 100 data professionals. She chairs a number of different communities, such as chairing the women's health movement, leading cross-industry data ethics advisory board, and being a member of the Mayor's Data for London Advisory Board, and so many more things. She has a real passion for AI and data. And I want to jump into this today because I want to understand why you do what you do, Natalie. So we're going to start right there. Why do you do what you do?
I think it's because I like solving problems. I've always been a bit of a fixer. So I've had what people would term a squiggly career. And I've worked in all sectors, third sector, public sector, private sector. But the thing that's connected it has been about how do you mobilize big movements of people for change? And to do that, you need to use technology. So digital and data became part of the way in which I needed to do things. And as a result of that, I then sort of fell in love with the way data could help solve problems, both now and in the future. And that led me to take a CEO job at a data and AI consultancy, or a consultancy that was building to be a data and AI consultancy, where I spent 5 years before I joined JMAN. And so I really just felt like I wanted to spend more and more time in a space that was emerging, that having been a sort of problem solver, be that for government, be that for private sector businesses, working on the London 2012 Olympics, how did I now use data and AI to do that so much more efficiently and help people solve their problems? So I come at it, whilst I did study economics and statistics and stuff back in the day, I would never have predicted that I would have ended up where I am now. And I come at it very much from a sort of business leader lens of somebody who sees the problem and then has learned the data and AI piece to be able to use it to facilitate solving those problems. And that's why a lot of my joy comes from helping other people solve their problems with data and AI, making it real for them. And that's what I spend my day job doing with JMAN. And I also train CEOs and business leaders in how to get value out of data and AI for an organization called Vistage, which I really enjoy. And then my sort of passion time, I suppose, gets spent with Women in Data, which is a movement of now nearly 90,000 women globally.
Wow, congratulations. That's amazing.
Yes, there is an amazing woman who started it called Rasheen, who is a fantastic individual and a very persuasive individual. So when I met her a few years ago, I'd met her and been really amazed and loved the community and what she'd created in an industry where so often I went to roundtables where, ironically, talking about diversity, where I was the only woman. And she said to me, I think there's some problems in society we should try and bring our community together to solve. And the two things that we particularly felt that data could really contribute to were women's health and women's safety. And so a brilliant colleague headed up the women's safety piece, and I took on the women's health piece. And that's really looking at how do we use data and the power of the community that we've got to be able to try and take some action towards the gender inequality that exists in healthcare. And so that was sort of how I got roped into that, but a couple of years ago, but I'm very glad that I did.
Yeah, sounds like it. Wow. Okay. You said a lot of things there. So I first of all, thank you. I think, having that passion for both of those topics and creating movement even is a huge undertaking, right? But so many things I want us to dive into there about, like, first of all, let's just talk about the resistance to data, right? Because oftentimes, I mean, I'm a business person and I love data because that helps you make decisions, right? But so often companies and people will resist, right? And so just in your experiences, where does that come from? And I have like a million questions. So what are your thoughts around that?
I think there's a few different places. Certainly, I've seen that change in recent years. So, generative AI and all the hype that came around it definitely did some good from that point of view, because all of a sudden leaders who would never have been bothered before, oh, isn't that someone's back office job? It doesn't apply in my industry. You know, we're in the hospitality industry. Why would that matter to us? You know, I suppose in lots of ways got scared and felt like they were behind and that they were going to miss out because there was so much hype around generative AI. And whilst hype has its disadvantages, I think the advantage was for people working in data teams, for people who were trying to push this agenda in their organizations, they were able to use it in an effective way to say, but actually we're nowhere near being able to do that because we haven't got our foundations right. And I think that's a thing we see a lot working at JMAN. We work particularly with sort of scale up businesses who are private equity backed and who are on that growth journey. And people are saying, oh, well, you know, how do we do this with generative AI? And we're saying, but you can't count your customers. You don't know who your customers are. And of course, there are efficiency tools with generative AI that we can use without having very good data, right? To speed us up, to enable us to do some marketing or sort of back office functions. But mostly we need to get our data in shape first, and need to get our foundations if we really want to get value from it. So I think the hype there has actually, I've certainly seen a different conversation. Like I'm on this speaker circuit to support CEO groups, and the number of bookings I got, for example, after that went up. And the engagement from leaders, as opposed to a few of them in the room thinking it was relevant to them, to the whole group being like, we are so excited about this session.
That's more.
Changed. So I think that's been quite positive for the industry. But I think you still see people feeling that there's not really alignment and it's not for them, or they don't necessarily get the value, or they see the value, but it's not something we're going to get around to yet. We're really busy, we're growing fast, we're sorting all this out. And some of the biggest mistakes you see is where businesses don't do it when times are good. So going back to the customer use case, people never do their customer segmentation when times are good. They're growing, they're adding customers, that's all great. What happens is as soon as that growth starts to drop off or they start to lose customers, they don't know why, because they haven't collected the data, they haven't got the data. They then need someone to come in and do that customer segmentation and understand what's happening so that they can pull levers. Whereas if you'd done that in the first place, as soon as things start to shift, you can see which levers you need to pull. And so one of the most common things boards will say to me is, your problem is they needed you 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Because they're coming now because they're hurting, right?
Yes.
But they won't come
they feel the pain.
Yeah. And so I think that's sometimes people haven't, you know, it takes for people to suffer and be frustrated before they will invest in it. And I think the other thing about data is it does air all your dirty laundry, right? And sometimes people don't want that aired. So, you know, in organizations, you'll end up with people who have a very strong view of a way things should be done, and they're not particularly interested in whether data is going to back that up or not. And so they don't want to be proven wrong. And I think, and some of the media hype hasn't helped with making people feel like their jobs are at risk if they sort of use this. So I think there's lots of things that play into it. But I am seeing an increased speed to
That's good.
up to this and an adoption of this and recognizing it's something we need to do. I also think the economic environment we now face is creating some pressure on that. So certainly from a PE perspective, we do a lot of work with people who are trying to go through exits, and the difference in what investors are looking to be able to answer now from even a few years ago, because the market's much tougher.
Right.
If they don't have strong data to back it up, they're just not going to get the valuation they want. But 3 years ago, they could have got away with it. And so that sort of market pressure, because, you know, interest rates have been higher and it's been tougher market conditions, costs have been higher. It means people have got to do more with less. And data then becomes a tool in helping them do that. So I think we are seeing a positive shift, but of course, there's always more to go.
Well, I love that. And, when you were talking about how oftentimes companies don't want to look at it until they start to see customers leaving, right?
Mm.
And the importance of that being proactive in recognizing what are you capturing and why are you capturing information and how are you using that information? And of course, the customer always wants to know, how are you using my information, right? But you can make really good decisions, even if it's a situation where you have to make changes and cuts. It helps you make the most logical and rational versus emotional decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And sometimes data won't give you the full picture, but it's a tool in making those decisions that needs to inform those conversations. And
exactly.
that's a judgment call based on the amount of data you've got to use. If you've got very rich data, then it can probably direct you to the right answer. Sometimes you might have patchy data, so that doesn't mean you can't use it, but you need to use it sensibly
Right.
to inform the conversation, but also bring other experts into the room to support that conversation.
Yeah.
And
Great
I
point.
think that's important, right? It's human plus data.
Yeah.
It generally shouldn't be data on its own.
Of course, always. Well, and I think to your point earlier when you were saying, people were fearful of generative AI because they're thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to be replaced? Is my job going to get, taken away from me? And so that fear kicks in, and people are often afraid of uncertainty or, what they don't know. And I see a shift in that too, where more people are starting to embrace it. And how can I use this in a way that's productive and positive? So I want to shift gears just a little bit because I think the movement that you have with safety for women, but also healthcare services for women and health for women. That's been a hot topic in my circles lately, and just the lack of knowledge, even sometimes that we have around things like menopause, as an example. So what are you seeing specifically from a healthcare perspective in how this data is helping to educate us and helping us to be more proactive?
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that some of the data doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so where we say there's lack of information, there genuinely is a lack of information. They do not have the data to be able to give us the answer. And that comes from a couple of different things. One is that we have been basically looking at the male body type
Mm-hmm.
for pretty much since the birth of modern medicine. So one of my sort of favorite worst statistics, if you like, is that chronic pain, 70% of the sufferers are women,
Yeah.
yet 80% of the trials were done on men or male mice.
Yes.
So even in things where we suffer more, we're still skewing the data towards how a man's body responds. So there's a lot where, and also because of a woman's cycle and the hormones through the different life stages, we've been seen as less reliable. There's periods of time where we haven't been wanted for clinical trials because we might be pregnant or going through things around pregnancy or their menopause, which they think will skew the results, or obviously they don't want to create risk for you in a pregnancy situation. So there's lots of reasons why, and not always negative, sometimes with best intent, why women haven't been included as much. And then the other problem is we don't have sex disaggregated data in a lot of these cases. So in about 50% of cases, we don't have sex disaggregated data for a lot of the studies that have been done. So sort of before you start, and before you get into anything else about how we spend money or anything else we do, we don't really have all the data that we need in order to be able to do things. I think what's really positive in recent years is that we are seeing a shift in starting to make the topic less taboo and being able to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that actually surprised me when I started the women's health work, we did a lot of workshops with clinicians, with businesses, individuals, community groups, to just see what was worrying them, what would they love to see, what would they love to see changed from a data perspective. And actually, just by holding those sessions, people were saying this has been amazing. I've talked to Vicki, she had this happen to her 2 years ago, we'd have never had that conversation in the workplace, she's now taking me for coffee, talk to me about it, it's so wonderful to have that support. And so we had to slightly rejig our plans because we realized that just creating community around this was also a really important part of what we needed to do, as well as the data angle. And I think, for businesses listening and anybody listening, the first thing is just starting the conversation. So maybe you can't contribute loads from the data perspective, maybe you don't know where to start, but actually just open the conversation in your workplace, make it a conversation that's okay, and sort of do some of these workshops and things like that, because it does really make a difference, and it does make a difference when you feel comfortable to be able to talk about this. So I suppose that's why we are where we are. If people have read Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, I wouldn't recommend reading it in one sitting because you will get angry.
Okay.
Sorry,
can you just repeat that, Natalie? I just want to make sure.
It's called Invisible Women.
Invisible Women, okay.
And it's by a lady called Caroline Criado Perez.
Okay.
It was written quite a few years ago now, actually, I think about 2015. But it explains some of the data on why the world has been designed for men, right? We are more likely to die in a car crash because car crash dummies were male when they were tested. So if me and my fiance are both in the same car, I am much more likely to die than he is. And it sort of explains all of these things from a data-driven point of view. So if you're interested in that, it's a great read. But as I say, maybe take it in chapters because otherwise you
great advice.
And then I suppose, how do you make progress on that? I think there's some really good work in lots of different places going on. Where we ended at Women in Data was, what can we do that makes sense given the network we have and the community we have? And we felt that quite often part of the problem is the data isn't connected. So there's no DNA of women's health in terms of the data being connected together. And if you think about what you experience, some of your data will be held by your doctor, your local doctor that you go to. Some of it will be on your Apple Watch that you're prepared to give your data to, or your apps that you track your cycle in, or your exercise or your weight. Some of it will be if you go into sort of public paid for healthcare, and it will be in their system, but maybe you've got private medical care, so some of it will be in their system, and the two systems don't talk to each other. And your pharmacist will have some other information about you, and there's all these pieces of the puzzle, but they very rarely get put together. And so we were thinking about, well, which pieces of the puzzle can we reach? And where we ended up was looking at retail data, because we work with a lot of retailers in our community.
Okay.
And what we're trying to do is, and this is a test, right? So we don't know if we can do it. We know we can do it. We don't know whether it will prove things. But what we're trying to do is see if we can use retail data to predict disease earlier in women. And we've started with endometriosis because it affects so many women, 1 in 10 worldwide. It takes between 7 and 10 years to get a diagnosis. And in that time, women are living in huge amounts of pain. There's actually been a study that's just come out in the UK from ONS, which is also about the reduced earnings of women who are living with that disease. Because, of course, if you're living with pain, you can't necessarily work as much.
Exactly.
Whilst there's no cure, there are treatments that can support managing the symptoms. If you could get to faster, then might be able to support the way that you could live. So we're really lucky to be working with partners who are supporting us with sharing their retail data, obviously anonymously. And essentially we're trying to use loyalty card data to track purchases, to be able to see what the patterns of products that potentially indicate that somebody is maybe suffering.
Okay.
And be able to see what's happening. And so we're working with researchers at universities, and we're working with, and I suppose that's the power of the Women in Data Network, is how do you bring together the different members of the network who have all got pieces of the puzzle. So we've got universities involved, we've got a leading gynecologist involved, we've got the retailers involved. There's lots of different people sort of pulling together to see if we're able to do this. And actually, Boots, who are part of the Women in Data community, did a study like this on ovarian cancer, working in partnership with Tesco, a retailer, and looking at loyalty card data. And they worked with a number of universities, so University of Birmingham, UCL, and others who were part of this. And they were able to identify ovarian cancer 8 months earlier.
Wow.
As a result of this basket analysis. And so what we're trying to see is, can that extend beyond that to other methods? And not to diagnose, obviously there's the role for doctors, but one of the things that came out of our workshops is, if we could be given more information to have more advocacy and be able to go and advocate for ourselves in a healthcare system that is struggling, then maybe we could get to care faster and be able to get to a better outcome. And we know that earlier diagnosis in basically all cases leads to a better outcome.
Sure.
So that's sort of what we're working on at the moment. And yeah, watch this space. But we're hoping that it might bear some fruitful results, and also perhaps give policymakers and those who fund these things perhaps different avenues to look at in thinking about how they go about this, and the richness that different data sets can bring together, other than just a standard sort of clinical trial route.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once you have figured out some of that information, then how do we educate doctors on that? And part of that is patient advocacy, to your point, of knowing when you go in to see your doctor how to even communicate, right? I just had that conversation with my son because he was like, well, my doctor didn't tell me this and this and this. And I said, yes, but did you ask the right questions? Right? So you have to arm yourself when you go in to be able to have those conversations. I find what you're doing so fascinating, and there's such a need. I mean, on so many levels, because, you were talking about endometriosis, and I look at women who have autoimmune issues, and that's happening even at a younger age. And the typical answer is we don't really know why, but you have this autoimmune issue. And there's so many factors, right? And people go for months and months and months, if not years, going undiagnosed. Not because the doctors don't want to, they just don't have the information. So it goes back to the work you're doing.
Well, and certainly I can't speak for Canada, but in the UK, our general practitioners, so our sort of doctors that we go to on a regular basis, they only started having to be trained in women's healthcare in the last sort of 18 months.
Yes.
That's madness. Like, we're 50% of the population. We make most of the consumer healthcare decisions, and yet it's not been trained on. And if you look at investment, the comparative investment in things which typically affect men more than women, and where you see amazing medical advances. So if you look at something like HIV, which used to be a death sentence, could be, like, now you have the same life expect because of the great advances in medicine. Right. If you get HIV, you've got the same life expectancy as anybody else. It doesn't affect that because it can be managed. But we don't see the same sort of investment going into things like endometriosis, people who suffer from migraines. As you say, things are starting to improve around menopause, but in our country, certainly men can still get Viagra on the NHS, which they don't have to pay for, and yet many women are sort of having to fight very, very hard to get HRT. So it's these discrepancies are sort of every single place in the system, and some of the statistics on dismissal as well of women and their symptoms, like, we are much less likely to be given painkillers.
Yes.
And so you see this, but you say, is that the doctor's fault? Well, as you say, they have to be educated too, and data can help with that. So the more data we get, the easier it is for them to be educated, to be able to then give better support. And that's why so much of this comes back to having the right data.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree on that. I mean, I think that, that's a step that is so critical. And when you were talking about this invisible woman, Carolina Perez, right? Is that who you said? Yes. Because I was doing some research recently with that. Joanna Aker had done a number of research articles on, most organizations believe they're gender neutral, but then when you start to really get in, so it's what you're talking about. Most systems in general are set up with very strong male nuances, and we don't even realize it. It's not even something that's conscious. And so this happens, like, just like the example you gave with Viagra versus HRT. And I know when I started in my menopause days, my GP was like, oh, I can't put you on HRT because you have this autoimmune issue. And I was like, okay, but like, this is driving me crazy and I need some support. Right. And so I went to my naturopath, who helped me get on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And now, of course, all these things are coming out about HRT. I was reading something yesterday saying that even women in their 70s and 80s now can actually use HRT, but because of the more data that we've gotten.
And that's where also it can be used badly. So there was a study done which basically scared everybody from using HRT around cancer, and the data wasn't robust at all. And that has put women off for generations, and people are still very nervous about it. And so we also have to be really responsible with the data that we put out there and be clear about what of it is, look, there's early indications that this might be something that needs to be investigated, versus this is a robust trial that we are confident has given us a result. So, and, you know, even when quite often in medicine, there are trades. So there, you know, from what they know, there are, of course, some risks to HRT, but also if you're somebody who goes into perimenopause very early, your risk of things like osteoporosis and other conditions like that are huge. So you have to weigh the risks. And that's why the data is really important, because, again, fundamentally, that needs to be our decision, because it's about the life we're going to lead. Yes. And the medics can give us some advice, but if they can't give us robust data, it's really hard to then be able to make decisions. And that's the same, you know, that's the same in healthcare as it is in business, but in healthcare, it's about your life.
Yeah.
And so we've got to be able to do that, you know, there's lots of things that we see. And I think the best doctors are the ones where they actually call it out and they say to you, we don't have the data to be able to tell you that.
Yeah.
But, you know, we have 1 in 10 women suffering from endometriosis, which is as painful as a heart attack or a stroke, but it happens to you perhaps every 6 weeks, depending on what you've managed to control. And yet we still know nothing medically about diet, exercise, lifestyle, and how that can help. There's still no concrete guidance on what that can do. And that seems madness, because a tenth minimum of the population are suffering from this. So it just seems crazy that we wouldn't sort of do that. And you know, prevention better than cure. So why aren't we able to understand the root causes of it? Why aren't we able to at least give people ways that, instead of having surgeries and things that risk future complications and things going wrong and impact fertility and all of those things, why aren't we trying to help people to be able to self-manage? And it feels like there is often not enough energy, research, money put into collecting that data, which actually individuals could then take into their own hands.
Well, and that's exactly it. It goes back to what you were saying earlier about being your own advocate, right? Like really understanding. And, you know, I have an autoimmune issue, and I developed it after I had my second child, and I couldn't get answers. I went for 18 months, not sleeping, in chronic pain, couldn't walk. Like, it was awful. And it took me a long time, but it was, to what you're just saying, I changed my diet, I changed my exercise, I tried all kinds of different types of therapies. And I remember my specialist saying to me, when I finally got into some kind of a calming phase, she was like, okay, I need to know what you've done. And right, because the typical is usually prescription, and nothing wrong with that, because I couldn't live without the prescriptions that I have. But there's so much more to it that we need to arm ourselves with. And so, to your point with, you know, collecting that data, informing yourself, making sure that you're researching it yourself becomes so important, because your doctors aren't going to know every single thing, because every person is different, right?
Yeah. And we do have to recognize that, like, we are not homogenous beings. We are all different. And, you know, the idea that a 5'2" woman and a 6'6" man are going to respond in exactly the same way to paracetamol is crazy, but we have the same dose as adults. Well, obviously it's going to take stronger effect on somebody's body that's smaller. And so you have to apply a level of common sense to this.
Yes.
But also, I think where you can take control of your data, you know, there's lots of different tracking apps and pros and cons, right? You need to think about who you're giving your data to. But I think, you know, doing things like tracking your cycle, we are not the same being every day of the month as a woman.
Yes.
And like getting that data and starting to understand how your hormones affect you, and therefore when you're at your best, when you're at your most productive, how you want to organize your work week, month around that, so that you get the best optimal life out of it, and you get less upset, less frustrated, and feel more productive and more sort of in flow. Those are sort of our own little data points that we can start to track and measure and take account of. And I think that does really, really help people. And people I know who have been through pregnancy, who are a bit more on top of, who've actually suffered from some of these hormonal conditions, are a lot more in tune with how hormones affect you, and so therefore have been able to cope with the sort of erratic, crazy hormone wash that you go through as a new mother and when you stop breastfeeding and all of those things, because they're just so much more in tune with, and then therefore their brain is able to say, this is your hormones doing this. And because they've learned about themselves. And so I think there are small things that we can do individually to sort of help us gather our own data points, to just start to learn a little bit more about our body. And that will be different for everyone because we are all different. But also learning what's normal for your body is really important. I always find it hilarious when I go into a doctor's surgery and they say, well, what's your pain level? On like a scale of 1 to 10, and I say, well, I suffer from very severe endometriosis, so for me this is like a 3, but for a normal person it might be a 6 or a 7. And so pain is all relative to what you otherwise experience, and that is not a very helpful measure. But if you know what's normal for you, you can then start to notice when things aren't normal. So I think, taking a little bit of time to collect your own data points about your body in a world where the medics don't yet have all the data, at least gives you a little bit of control.
I think that's such a fabulous example that you just shared about, your pain level 1 to 10, because that is the normal, how they ask, right? And it just you took me back in time when I first was having the issues I was having. And I remember a nurse asking me, they had to take me from one hospital to another because they didn't have the equipment to do an MRI. And she said to me, she goes, what are your pain levels like? And they were like crazy, right? And she goes, okay, but like you've had all this morphine. And she goes, and you're fully coherent and having this. She goes, I've never had anybody who could do that. And I was like, really? And she goes, yes. And like, I know, because I've given you this morphine, I know how much you've had. And she goes, and you're having a fluid conversation with me. So everybody is different, to your point. And so it is recognizing what's tougher or what's impacting you for you, like what's different from your norm. And, I'm not being sexist here, but like oftentimes small things hurt them more than they do women. And so there's, again, to your point about having data points on men versus having on women, it's recognizing that it impacts us differently as beings, right? So that becomes really important. And just the awareness, right? Like when you've gone through it, then you can empathize, and you can also see when somebody else is having some of those issues. Yeah. So Natalie, I think where I'd like to kind of wrap us up today is, so what do you think is at least one thing that our audience could walk away with today to, help them manage data, and to help them manage their health better?
So I think I'll probably struggle to do one thing, but maybe I could give you a couple of things to think about. So I think one, from a business perspective, if you want to, we talked about resistance to use of data. If you're a leader and you want people to use data in your organization, you have to start doing it. And what happens is you pull together your dashboard and your data is rubbish, because people are not filling in your Salesforce or your HubSpot or whatever your CRM is, because good salespeople, to be honest, do not want to do that. If they love doing it, they're probably not good salespeople. Yeah. So, you've got to force them to do the admin. Nobody's, you're a professional services business. Nobody's filling in their timesheets properly, and that's not pulling through. All of those different things. But if you start using that data to make decisions, you will never see change as quickly. So now I can't hire somebody else because our utilization rates are saying they're 50%. Oh, but that's not true because so-and-so is too busy to do their timesheet. Okay, well, I have to make decisions on this data. So I think, thinking about how do you start to create that culture in your business starts at the top, and just start using it, even when it's not right and it's not ready, because it's the fastest way to get it right and ready. So that would be my sort of top tip there. And know where your starting point is and start where you're at. If you can't count your customers, do not go crazy on generative AI. And actually, I'm seeing in the US a trend where the data fundamentals are quite often a bit further behind the UK. But the prevalence of use of generative AI and testing AI use cases is higher. And that, it feels very dangerous to me, because it's sort of know you can run before you sort of try and sprint. And so getting those foundations right, and it's not about where everybody else is at. It's about finding what's right for you and getting going, and making sure it connects to your business strategy and the plan you're trying to achieve. So I think from a business perspective, that's probably the stuff I would think about. From a health and individual perspective, I would think about sort of what I said about how do you gather your own data about you? Do you actually know your body? And what do you know about it? Because we know our bodies better than anybody. And the more we can understand how they're working and what's going on, the more we can easily spot when something's not normal for us. We know the earlier we get help, normally the better the outcome. And I think many of us are always putting getting help off because we're too busy and we're working hard. And so, but if you really understand your body, you do know when those things are happening, but also you're able to start to optimize the way that you work based on what you understand about your body and how your body works best. You know, we've always talked about some people are night owls and some people like the early morning, and, you know, we try and organize around that, but there's a lot more to it. You are governed by hormones, particularly as a woman. And so I think sort of doing that, and I think the one thing, man or woman, you can do is try and have the conversation and open it up in your workplace, whether that's with menopause workshops, whether that's with discussing what some of the challenges are in women's health, like look at some of the statistics together. What does that mean? How does that feel for the people in your business? How do I, as a male manager, support somebody who's going through that? Those sorts of things should be thought about, because if you can make it, it doesn't fix it, but the medics need to help us do that. But if you can make that journey a bit easier to live with, then you're doing something right.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And you just prompted several more questions that I have in my head. So just, that is so important. And a comment I would add to that first, and then I do want to ask you another question. So often women in particular will just think it's temporary. So they're not listening to the signs. And I'm saying that from personal experience. It took 3 massive hits over the head before I realized I'm in trouble, right? And so to your point, I want to acknowledge and validate that the importance of knowing your body, knowing what's happening with you, and not just being dismissive because you're busy, right? Because sometimes it's you have kids or you're caring for parents or you're busy at work or whatever, but knowing that your body that's your shell that only you can take care of. So I think that's important. But I do want to come back to what you just said there, because we see this shift happening. And there was a lot of stuff this morning in the media about how so many organizations are moving away from their DEI strategies. And what you just shared, I think, was so important about men paying attention to what is actually happening. And so, you know, in that particular arena, we've got major organizations pulling back and saying, we're not doing this anymore. What are the risks of doing that?
I think that, look, there's no point in having a DEI strategy if you don't live it and you don't actually achieve anything. So there is an element of, if they're pulling back lip service, that doesn't really matter. If they're pulling back things that are genuinely making difference in organization, that is a problem. And I don't know what, you know, go back to the data. I don't know what else people need to see other than that teams that are more diverse, boards that are more diverse, in every which way, are more successful. You know, there is data that if you have women on your board, you are more successful. If you have ethnic minorities on your board, you are more successful. Because shockingly, we all have different lived experience. Our brains, like as men and women, our brains are biologically wired in different ways. We bring very complementary skill sets to the table, and the sum is definitely greater than our parts. And I just think you know, when you make policies, when you set up your organization, you see it in government. When I'm not saying, you know, I can't represent every woman in the business. Like, we are all different. We are in the same way as no man can represent every man in the business. Or, you know, my fiance is Nigerian. He doesn't represent every Nigerian that exists, and he will have a different lived experience from other people. But if you don't even attempt to put some diversity from a socio-economic perspective, from a ethnicity perspective, from a gender perspective, from a faith perspective in the room, you're just not even at the starting block. So yes, we can't represent everybody, but hopefully we will have connections that other people won't have, which will have changed the way that we think, but will hopefully bring things to the table. Some of the policies we saw coming out of COVID, when sort of cleaners and nannies were allowed back, that was made by a very clear socioeconomic cohort where that was their pressure. And yet you could go to a football match in the UK to see soccer before you could have your partner with you when you were going through a scan for your baby. Like, that is not a health and safety thing, right? Because if I'm allowed to go and see 30,000 people, me being one extra person in a room isn't. So there were decisions made, and again, I don't think there was any ill intent, but people were not in the room and nobody was questioning it and nobody was looking at it. And I think you have to be very careful if you're pulling back on these things to say, but how are we keeping that control? How are we watching out for bias? And actually, in a world in which we're introducing generative AI, and the big difference with generative AI is that data used to be controlled by data teams or finance analysts or people who knew what they were doing with it. And so it was relatively safe with some guardrails around. What has happened with generative AI is the big difference is it's now in everybody's hands. And so anybody in your organization could potentially be using it, giving away your data, trading data, whatever, without understanding it, which is why the guardrails and the training and all of those things are really important for organizations and making sure that you're clear on how it can be used. But when you think about that, there's a lot of that is trained on historic data. So we have been a sexist and racist society. We know that. And actually, I'm quite worried about the fact that if we're going to use a lot of these models to be able to make decisions for us, there's going to be more racism and sexism. And you'll have seen the things on LinkedIn, right, where you type in to a generative AI thing, pictures of doctors, and you get loads more white men. And the percentage of that is not right compared to the percentage in the US or Canada or in the UK. Whichever country you're operating in. So we know that those tools have bias in them, right? They've been trained by historic data, which is biased. So there's a lot of these sort of new things that are coming out where you're going to have to think about the bias and how do you counter it and how do you educate on it. So if you're not prepared to have a DEI strategy as an organization, but you're wanting to adopt some of these new tools, you've got to work out how you're going to reconcile that. And I just, for me, working in diverse businesses has been the best experiences of my life. It's taught me the most different things. I think it's made me a more rounded individual as a result of it. And I was very, very lucky to work at the London 2012 Olympics, and there was a big, big push there for diversity and inclusion. And I learned a lot from the people that tried to sort of make that happen. You can't always affect everything, right? Like in my last organization, I managed to get us to 50-50 women and 1% gender pay gap, but I tried just as hard on ethnic minority talent, and I only shifted a few percent, whereas I shifted 20%, and I got more than 50% on the leadership team. But they saw it and they believed it, right? A CEO who's a woman who's doing these things and saying these things and on these stages, they believed that it was true. And it was much harder for them to believe that I cared as much about Black talent because I wasn't a role model for that talent. And so, you have to have those role models to support, and you've got to recognize perhaps where you as an individual in an organization can make the biggest shift, because that, if you all align your efforts, and maybe you can do something really special. But for me, it's very disappointing to see. I do think data can be a big measure of where DEI strategies aren't working. And I've done work before on that, where you look at the, what are actually the things that are making people leave the workplace. So you're able to see from the data, actually, we're trying to keep women, but we're losing them faster than we're putting them in the hopper, or we're trying to keep Black talent and we're losing them faster than we're putting them in the hopper. So, data can help you with that. And what are the main reasons that these people are leaving? So actually, we don't need 20 policies. We don't need a massive DEI team, but we need maybe 1 or 2 policies or 1 or 2 things that we put in place that are going to make a big difference. And I think organizations that don't take it seriously will fundamentally, the data's already there to tell us that they won't do as well in the medium and long term. So it seems very short-sighted from my point of view.
Wow, I'm so glad I asked the question.
I rambled.
No. Please do not apologize. No, I think what you shared there was so important on so many levels because the data is there. You just have to look at it and really ask yourself the question as to what is happening, right? If you're setting policies that, are excluding people, right? Look, women as an example, why are you doing it? What is the real reason behind it? And oftentimes that those policies are not even conscious. So you do need to take a look at the data. And I wanted to bring that up because the work you're doing is very important to help have a objective perspective as to the reality that's happening within an organization. So where can people find you? If they have more questions about how to use data, generative AI, like how to use that in a positive, productive way, where can they find you?
So I'm Natalie Cramp. I'm on LinkedIn. There aren't many of me, I don't think, on LinkedIn. You can find me or through JMAN Group. So if you go through our website, you can reach out through our website as well.
Amazing.
And I would love to hear from people who are interested.
Yes. Like, seriously, like everybody that's listening to this conversation today, share this with your company, share this with your connections. There's so many different avenues that we took today, but at the end, it all comes down to that awareness and using those data points to help you make better choices, better decisions. Natalie, what a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for coming in and joining us and just sharing your expertise with us.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I should also say that Women in Data is a free network, free at the point to members. So they can, if you go on the Women in Data website, it's all branded red. It's very easy to find. You'll be able to sign up as a member, and there's all sorts of webinars and ways to get involved in the community. So that's something globally, as I say, that is a movement if people want to become part of it. And it's certainly been a brilliant network for me, sort of linking back to that diversity and sort of where I found my people in data when I sort of entered an industry that I didn't feel like I looked very native in. So it's good. And thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. So hang with me, Natalie. Don't go anywhere. Audience, I want to thank you for chiming in. We know you have a choice, but thank you so much for continuing to support the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Our objective is to really bring you great content and, broaden your perspectives and really get you to think about, how to show up in the world, how to show up maybe differently, or to share it with somebody who needs to hear a different perspective. And, as always, we have a gift for you. If you're listening to this today, you can visit us at Women in Leadership Empowered. Go on and take our free leadership quiz. This gives you a lot of insight as to how you're showing up in the world. And there's a few other goodies that go with that. So please do visit the Women in Leadership Empowered podcast or website so that you can take advantage of that. Thank you again for joining us and wishing everyone a safe and productive week ahead. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for WIL Talk, sponsored by Women in Leadership Empowered. To learn more about our programs, please visit www.willempowered.com. We look forward to seeing you in our community.